Good morning, everyone. This is the September 14th meeting of the City Finance Committee meeting. And may I have a roll call, please?
Yes. Committee Member Harmon?
Here.
Committee Member Gutierrez?
Here.
And Committee Chair Friedman?
Here. We are all present, so we are on to public comment. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak to an item that is not on today's agenda, but under the purview of the Finance Committee? Mr. DiMartini, do you see anybody who's wishing to speak?
Yes, Chair Friedman, there are people attending the meeting today, but no one from the public has their hands raised at this time.
I'll just give it another couple seconds if anybody does want to raise their hand. Please do so now if you want to speak to any items not on the agenda. Okay, not seeing any, I will move on to our agenda items for today. And item 1 is the fiscal year 2021 fourth quarter review. And I will turn it over to you, Mr. DiMartini.
Great, thank you very much, Chair Friedman, members of the committee. My name is Keith DiMartini. I'm the Finance Director for the city. And it is my pleasure, along with a few staff, to present an update on our fourth quarter financial review for fiscal year 2021. Next slide, please. So the objective of today's presentation is for the committee to receive a report from staff on the status of revenues and expenditures that have been received and expended for the full 12 months ending June 30th, 2021, including a number of fourth quarter budget adjustments that are required to close out the fiscal year. Next slide, please. The agenda for today's meeting is for staff to provide you a very high-level overview of the projection, focusing on the general fund primarily, as well as giving an update on enterprise funds as well. For the general fund, we will go into quite some detail in regards to revenue changes that have occurred, expenditure changes that have also occurred, and what the impact on the ending revenues and expenditures are projected to be for the general fund reserves, which I know is a topic that we've been talking about quite regularly with Finance Committee and the City Council. We'll also go into just a little bit of detail about the proposed budget adjustments and then have next steps and be able to take any questions that you might have. Next slide, please. So this slide here summarizes the annual review process with the Finance Committee and the City Council for the review of the city's financials. So first and foremost, we do provide a monthly financial statement that goes on consent to the City Council every month that just shows what revenues have come in and what has been expended in each of the funds across the city. On a quarterly basis, we do a rather robust review and a projection during quarter 1 through quarter 3 of where staff anticipates ending up on both our revenues and expenditures. And then today we provide you an update as of the end of quarter 4, now that we have all 12 months worth of activity in our systems, and we have closed the books for most of the transactions. And now over the next few months, we'll be working very hard with our audit firm to conduct a thorough audit on our financial statements in preparation for us presenting the annual comprehensive financial report to the Finance Committee and City Council in December. So we're getting close to the end of our fiscal year 21 reporting period. Next slide, please. These two graphs just show a really high level breakdown of the revenues in the general fund and the expenditures. On the left-hand side shows our revenues, primarily general fund revenues coming from property taxes at 23% of the total, and then sales tax making up both sales and use tax and our Measure C district sales tax at a total of 28%. And you can see that the city generates general fund revenues from other revenues from departmental operations such as park and recreation, police and other activities, as well as transient occupancy tax and other taxes as well. On the expenditure side, which is very similar to many cities across California in particular, a majority of our general fund revenues go to pay for public safety functions, primarily police and fire, at close to half of our general fund budget. The other portions of the pie go to community services such as library and parks and recreation, community development functions in public works, and a few other operations as well. Next slide, please. So now I just want to transition and provide you a brief overview of where we are ending up at the end of Q4 for the general fund specifically. Next slide, please. So this slide here summarizes comparing our adopted and revised budgets to where our year-end actuals are ending up at, comparing revenues and expenditures and the change from that, the surplus or the deficit in our annual reporting period. So the adopted budget, as you may recall, did include the use of reserves of around $2.8 million. That was after taking into consideration more than $6 million of expenditure reductions that were required in all departments in order to help balance the budget due to the effects from COVID still on our general fund revenue sources. The revised budget, it showed that we had to incur additional expenses above and beyond what we were originally anticipating, some of which were due to some one-time expenses related to some rather large claims and settlements that had to be paid out during the year, which we brought to the Finance Committee and Council during the year. And now where we end up at year-end actuals, I'm happy to report that our year-end financials are in a much more positive state due to some items that we're going to talk about in some detail with you today. And I want to go into some detail on the next slide, please. So this slide here summarizes the major changes from where staff was projecting through Q3, just over 3 months ago, to where we are ending up now, highlighting what those major changes are from the most current projection. So first and foremost, the level of sales tax activity from general retail and online transactions was much greater towards the end of the fiscal year, in May and June in particular. That had to do with just additional spending that was occurring across the economy here in Santa Barbara County, but also had to do with a number of deferred payments. Many businesses took advantage of the state's deferral program. And so much of the sales tax revenue that we received in the last quarter had to do with deferred payments, so not pure activity that was occurring during that time. We also saw some additional Measure C sales tax activity as well, around $3 million for each of those. Our TOT, our transient occupancy tax, or our hotel tax, was also about $1 million greater than we were originally projecting it to be. That had to do with increases in the average daily rate. Ms. Tomaszewski is going to go into quite some detail about this as well coming up here on the next few slides. On the expenditure side, above and beyond the expenditure reduction targets of about $6 million that were included in each of the operating departments' budget, department staff were able to realize an additional $2.8 million of expenditure savings above and beyond those $6 million, that $6 million target, from continuing to hold some positions vacant and to continuing to be very conservative and pragmatic about trying to reduce expenditures wherever possible. Staff were able to realize additional savings. And then finally, and the most significant, was the implementation of the council's action to direct the American Rescue Plan Act recovery funds, the rescue funds, into the general fund. And Ms. Tomaszewski is going to go into detail about that as well. But that revenue into the general fund was a big plus for the city's financials towards the end of the year, and it has an impact on our reserves as well. So next slide, please. So now I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Tomaszewski, who's going to go into quite some detail about the major changes on the general fund revenues.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Friedman, committee members. I'm Jennifer Tomaszewski, Finance and Treasury Manager. And as Mr. DeMartini stated, I'm going to provide some of the highlights on the general fund revenues and how they performed at year end. Mr. DeMartini talked about some of the revenue changes from third quarter and the total revenues and expenditures. Now I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on some of the larger variances, specifically with the tax revenues and the other general fund revenues. Next slide, please. So this first slide is a summary of the general fund tax revenues. These account for about 2/3 of our general fund budgeted revenues, the largest being property tax, sales tax in Measure C, and TOT, or transient occupancy tax. You will see some of the arrows point to some of the larger variances. However, you're also going to notice property taxes up about 2.1 million. This is mainly due to conservative budgeting as opposed to unanticipated revenues received in property taxes this year. In recent years, we usually forecast about a 5 to 6% annual increase in those revenues. That's what we've seen in recent years. However, in 21, when COVID first happened, we didn't budget any of those percentage increases, so we kept that number flat, and just with so many uncertainties at the time. However, that 5% increase on average is still held true. The other increases, or the other variances, being sales tax and TOT, we're going to look at it in some upcoming slides. But before I move on, I just wanted to recap with all the variances. Our total tax revenues came in about 6.7 million over budget and about 8% higher than last year. And if you look in the far corner, prior year percentages, you'll notice that all the revenues this year are higher with the exception of business licenses. This is because business license costs are mainly calculated based on a business's prior 12 months gross revenues. So we anticipated there'd be a lag before we saw any of the impacts of COVID, but that's what we're seeing here. Next slide, please. So sales tax. So at third quarter, we forecasted sales tax to end the year roughly around a little over 21 million. And as you saw on that last table, we had a really strong fourth quarter and ended the year closer to 24 million. This is about 24% higher than pre-COVID fourth quarter in 2019. Each year, we put a lot of thought and effort in how we forecast these numbers. However, with COVID, it's really been a moving target with so much uncertainty. Sales tax is also one of our more complicated revenue streams to break down because there are so many variables that we have to consider. So for example, even prior to COVID, we saw changes in consumer behavior where more people started buying online. And then California recently passed legislation that began taxing on those online sales. And the dust hadn't really settled on that yet when COVID hit. And then on top of that, the state declared that businesses could defer sales tax payments temporarily in order to assist their businesses' short-term cash flows, which was great for the businesses, but created another level of complexity in trying to forecast the impact to our sales tax. When the revenues when we see a reduction in revenues, we really couldn't tell if it was because businesses were closing versus taking advantage of those deferral programs. And then with that, in addition, we also really have to look at all the different sectors separately. They each have their own trends and perform differently, both pre and during COVID. So historically, we've seen auto sales, retail, tourism, and even construction have been some of our larger sectors in sales tax collections. when COVID hit, we saw restaurants and fuel initially dropped. And at the same time, we saw increases in grocery sales, some of which are non-taxable, but additional increases in online purchases, and then even alcohol and cannabis increased, even though on a much smaller scale, comparing their sectors to some of the larger. But the real unknown, in my opinion, has been the impacts of inflation. Inflation has also had different impacts within the various sectors. So for example, our average CPI right now is somewhere around 5.3%, I think in August. Used cars have increased 27% in the last year. Fuel's up now 42%. Construction, lumber and steel have trended way up. And I think lumber's come back down again, but those have had huge impacts in the numbers and make it really difficult to forecast how the revenue is going to perform. And then another factor is the federal stimulus money and pent-up demand for spending after the lockdowns. So we really have to look at all of these things when we're trying to estimate the impacts of our sales tax revenues. I would say in this fourth quarter, the biggest changes that we really couldn't have anticipated was the continued growth of the online sales. And then as Mr. DeMartini spoke about with the deferred payments, we work with our consultants on these forecasts, and we really didn't expect to see the large volume of, we received probably around 800,000 in deferred payments, which we really just did not expect. And then the inflationary impact. So those three really affected this last quarter. So with that last quarter ending strong, it boosted our year-end results, but it's not quite out of the woods, as you know, we just don't know how long it's going to last. So really strong numbers, but there's still a lot of uncertainty, and it's likely going to be a moving target for the foreseeable future. Next slide, please. Mr. DeMartini also spoke about the average daily rates for TOT, and this next slide is a visual representation of that. The two factors that we look at are, with our TOT revenues, are the ADR, or average daily rate, and the occupancy percentages. So this chart tracks 2 years going back to pre-COVID and back to August of 2019. And the orange line shows occupancy trends over these last couple years. And the blue line represents the ADR. And what you see now is we're really at an all-time high for our ADRs. They're now over $400 a night, whereas occupancy is just now catching up to pre-COVID. So what does this mean? So prior to COVID in fiscal year 19, we received about $19.5 million in TOT revenues. This year, we still, even though it's gotten, we've had stronger performance in the last several months over the summer, we still ended the year about 15.7 million. So we are on that path of recovery, not fully recovered yet, but a lot of it's going to hinge on whether the rates and the occupancy hold. Again, these are really based on continued economic recovery and travel trends in the near future. So we will continue watching that as well. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to switch gears away from tax revenues and talk about some of the other revenues in the general fund. And in this slide, you see the three largest are the intergovernmental, which is highlighted here, the 17 million circled on the earth, with the highlighted on the table. And then fees and charges, which are departmental revenues, and then miscellaneous revenues, which are really the overhead allocations, transfers, and one-time payments in nature. The largest variance is the intergovernmental revenues. These came in at 17 million, or about 12 million over budget. So this is the category where we received that federal American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA money, and earlier this year, some CARES Act money. We did not budget for this. There was uncertainty about if we would receive it, when we would receive it, how much we were going to be allocated. But this is where you see that. And I have another slide that we will look at the ARPA money a little bit more. But before I move on here, you know, this 12 million unbudgeted revenue is offset by some deficits, mainly in the departmental revenues, and then also fines and forfeitures. Fines and forfeitures was down about 1.7 million, mainly due to parking citation revenue losses. During the pandemic, parking enforcement operated with minimal staffing and enforcement. And then on the departmental charges, we're going to look at that on one of the upcoming slides. But again, just to recap, other revenues ended the year about 5.5 million above budget. That would have been a very, very different picture had we not received that federal funding. So next slide, please. So with regard to the federal relief money, we've added a few bullet points for your information. So we were allotted or allocated a little less than 22 million for the city of Santa Barbara. Actually we've looked at this quite extensively now at this point. We estimate citywide those revenue losses to be about 30 million. We received that first payment of half of that 22 million. We received that in May of this year. We expect to receive the second payment in May of next year. It's federal funding that could change, but as of right now, we're going to assume that we're still receiving that. And then City Council approved that ARPA funds to offset the COVID-related revenue losses. Next slide, please. So this last slide, this is a summary of the impacts, the deficits to the departments, and the departments most affected by that, by the pandemic. Community development was one of the more impacted with their zoning and building permits. Parks and recreation with their recreation programs and facility rentals. The police department lost revenues due to lack of special events and vehicle release fees. And then Public Works with the decline in plan check fees. So this concludes my portion of the presentation. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Mr. DeMartini, unless you have any questions.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ms. Tomaszewski. So let's switch gears now to talk about general fund expenditures. Next slide, please. So just a reminder that in the adopted budget for fiscal year 21, it did call for just over $6 million of expenditure reductions in operating departments in order to help balance the budget for fiscal year 21. That was primarily due to the deficit that was continuing from the decline in general fund revenues that we've already discussed today. And it also required the use of holding many positions vacant or continuing to hold them vacant from when COVID first began so that we can achieve those savings. And that of course had an impact on the delivery of services across the city. And even with those reductions, it still required the use of about $2.7 million of general fund reserves in order to balance the budget in fiscal year 21. Next slide, please. This slide here lists all of the departments that are funded through the general fund and what their revised budgets are, what the year-to-date actuals are projected to be, and the changes from budget to actual. And I know there's a lot of numbers on this slide, but just the high-level takeaway on this slide is that I'm happy to report again that all departments that had targeted reduction savings met those targets by the end of fiscal year 21, which is a really difficult thing to do and a really great achievement for departments to achieve that. And I'm also happy to say that many of these departments were able to achieve savings above and beyond those targets. Again, by continuing to hold positions vacant, continuing to be very sort of critical about expenditures that they're planning in those departments and seeing what they can reduce or perhaps delay. And so we were able to achieve additional savings above and beyond those targets. Again, I'm happy to report that. Next slide, please. So now that we've spoken about revenues and where we're ending up and also about expenditures, I'd like to present an overview of where we're projecting our year-end general fund revenues to end up. Next slide, please. So again, just so that we're all on the same page about what the City Council's direction and their policy objective is for retaining adequate general fund reserves. The general fund reserve policy, as authorized by a City Council resolution, is to keep around 25% of the annual expenditure budget, the future annual expenditure budget, in reserve, and have that be for contingency use if we need to tap into them for specific purposes, and then also in the event of a disaster. And the City Council has authorized staff to dip into reserves over many years, actually for very specific and strategic purposes. And we've been able to do so successfully, and also have been able to replenish those reserves over time. This table here summarizes our reserve position at the end of fiscal year 2019 and fiscal year 2020. And you can see in fiscal year 2020, staff and the city had to dip into those reserves pretty substantially, around $8.5 million, in order to continue to operate and to deliver services. We were projecting to have to dip into those reserves much greater, much further in the current fiscal year, in fiscal year 21. But due to the additional upside in sales tax and transient occupancy tax, the additional expenditure savings that departments were able to achieve, and then also with the implementation of the ARPA rescue funds, our reserve position has gotten much better than we were projecting throughout the year due to this fiscal discipline. And we're projecting to be around $37 million of an ending reserve balance, which is effectively replenishing not only the disaster reserves, which we were dipping into, but also the contingency reserves. Next slide, please. This slide here shows the reserve position in the general fund over the past 16 years. And it shows how we were required to dip into those reserves over the past few years and substantially in fiscal year 20. And it shows that we have effectively replenished them in fiscal year 21 again as well. And the most recent time that the city has had to utilize general fund reserves was during the Great Recession back in 2008 and 2009. And you can see it was a rather long haul to replenish those reserves over a period of 7 to 8 years. Again, the city did not receive any federal rescue or relief funds during that time. And so, and the other factors that we've talked about today as well were a contributing factor to increasing our reserves back up to basically the reserve policy target. Next slide, please. I was very happy to provide this report to the Finance Committee today, but I must do so with caution, and also to reiterate some of the considerations that are before us operating as a city today in this current fiscal year, in fiscal year 22. Fiscal year 22's adopted budget has a structural operating deficit of $8 million. We were able to strategize and achieve a balanced budget by again implementing continued departmental expenditure reductions of approximately $6 million and some other changes, and also requiring the use of about $1 million of general fund reserves. So again, we're already back into contingency reserves in fiscal year 22. As we've indicated earlier today, there is continued economic uncertainty with our general fund revenues, primarily with sales tax and TOT. Whatever gets approved and negotiated with the labor unions might also have an impact on needing to require the use of reserves to move forward. There's also, to reiterate a presentation from the budget process as well, our self-insurance fund continues to be under-reserved. The amount of reserves we have in our self-insurance fund is drastically lower than what it should be. And so that continues to be an area of risk and an area of continued focus in future years. And then also the second tranche of the ARPA funds is scheduled for May of 2022, but that is a number of months away, and there is some potential risk as far as the timing or the amount, depending on what the federal government chooses to do with the infrastructure bill or other potential legislation as well. So we will closely monitor that and provide updates to the Finance Committee when staff learns more about that second payment of ARPA funds. Next slide, please. So I just want to provide a really brief overview of where the enterprise funds are shaping to end up fiscal year 21. Next slide, please. So this slide here shows a high-level overview of the solid waste fund, the water fund, the wastewater fund, and the downtown parking fund, their revenues and expenditures, and the change that's expected in their reserves. The solid waste, water, and wastewater funds are in good fiscal health at this time. They're actually adding a little bit of money into the reserves at the end of the year, having a little bit more revenue than their expenditures. Downtown parking, as we've talked about before, continues to have challenges with a much less parking activity going on in the city's parking lots. And so you can see that their revenues were budgeted at $7 million, but they actually came in at $5 million. So that's a change of just about $2 million. And they continue to have some operating expenditures that couldn't be reduced or changed drastically. And so they're requiring the use of their reserves of just over $1 million. So that will be an area of continued focus to ensure that downtown parking achieves fiscal sustainability as we find ourselves moving outside of COVID. Next slide, please. This slide here summarizes Santa Barbara Clean Energy Fund, the Airport Fund, Golf Fund, and Waterfront. And each of these funds is in fairly good fiscal health. It's important to note that the airport did receive direct fiscal aid from the federal government throughout COVID, which definitely helped them to continue to operate and sustain their operation. The Golf Fund, as we've talked about before, there was a lot more interest in playing golf as a COVID safe activity. And so that fund is in fairly good fiscal health as well. And the Waterfront has seen positive sign from their rent deferral program. And many of the tenants have been able to take advantage of that program and are making due on paying their rents since COVID began, which is, again, a really, really great sign. Next slide, please. This slide here summarizes the reserve position in each of the enterprises that we're anticipating by the end of the year. I just want to highlight here again, downtown parking, the sort of the risk and the continued focus on downtown parking's revenues and their expenditures and monitoring their reserves closely as we move into the upcoming budget cycle. Next slide, please. So now I just want to give you a really brief overview of the proposed budget amendments that are before the City Council today for your consideration. Next slide, please. Just going to highlight the budget amendments that are focused on the general fund. We mentioned earlier that the Measure C sales tax revenue is coming in around $2.7 million greater than originally budgeted. So there's a budget amendment before you that is more of a technical budget amendment to appropriate that extra revenue and place it in our Measure C fund so that it can be considered for a future Measure C funded project later on. So it's more of a technical adjustment to recognize that revenue. There are some minor adjustments for building permit revenue and using that for some technology upgrade projects. Next slide, please. For the library, there's a request to use some appropriation that's available, again, for some technology projects as well. And there's a minor increase in Park and Recreation donations for revenue that they received. Next slide, please. The attachment on your agenda report includes a number of other budget adjustments that are described in quite some detail. You can see a list, sort of a summary list of what those adjustments are on this slide. Again, refer to attachment 3, and staff is available for any questions that you might have on this as well. Next slide, please. So staff's recommendation is that the Finance Committee recommend to the Council today that they accept the fiscal year 21 interim financial statements for the 12 months ended June 30th of 2021 and approve of the proposed fourth quarter adjustments to the fiscal year 21 appropriations and estimated revenues as detailed in the attached schedule of adjustments. And with that, staff is available to help answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. DeMartini, for, I guess, the excellent news in terms of our reserves and higher revenues. So before I open up for public comment, do any of my colleagues have questions regarding the staff report today? Hearing none, I would, Mr. DeMartini, if you could turn your camera on for just a moment. In terms of planning for actually next year, but it's part of this year's budget, how are we looking at the second round of the Rescue Act funds? It was split into the 2 years. So how are we planning for that or budgeting, and what are some of the things we're watching in terms of the second $10.9 million?
Yes, Chair Friedman, thanks for that question. So again, the second payment of the ARPA funds is scheduled to be received in May of 2022. So that is in this current fiscal year. In our adopted budget for fiscal year 22, that amount of revenue has not yet been budgeted. Again, has not been budgeted based on the uncertainty that surrounds that potential payment, the amount of it, and the timing. And then also, there still is some discretion. There's direction that the city council can provide to staff about how you would like to use that money. The first payment of the $10.9 million was used to partially offset the revenue that we've lost. We have demonstrated that we have lost way more revenue than the ARPA funds are able to replenish for the city. And so that was the direction on the first payment. So we will have a conversation with the city council over the course of the next few months and during the upcoming budget process about how options for the city council to consider for that second payment of ARPA funds.
And then the other thing, as you and I discussed, is it may come in with, it might be designated for certain uses. It might not be the same as the first round where it was, we had the discretion. It might come with restrictions on it. Is that correct? It could, we're watching that as well.
Yes, Chair Friedman, that is correct. That could occur. The federal government could change the way in which that second ARPA payment comes in, the amount, the timing, and then put some additional restrictions on it. The ARPA package did have some restrictions about specific uses for it. Using it as we did to offset our revenue loss was one of the legitimate uses for it. And there are a few others, but there could be others that could be put on it as well.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that for the upcoming year because of the implications of what happened last year with this. We're still kind of in the same boat as last year with this second round. So
Yes.
Any questions again from my colleagues? Not seeing anyone's light turned on. Are there any members of the public that wish to speak to this item? If you could raise your hand in the app. And Mr. DiMartini, do you see anyone raising their hands?
Chair Friedman, I am monitoring public comment and I am not seeing any hands raised at this time.
Okay, so I will go ahead and close public comment. And we do need a motion to accept the interim financials and approve the fourth quarter adjustments. So if I could have a motion from one of my colleagues or any comments as well.
I will make the motion to approve them.
Motion's been made. And Councilmember Harmon. She was having trouble with her internet before. So we'll give her a second, but I'll go ahead and second the motion. And then I do just want to thank you, Mr. DiMartini and Ms. Tomaszewski, for all your work in presenting this today and working within our departments to understand the financials. I think it's great that we now have the reserves fully funded again. And to all of our departments that contributed in terms of budget saving measures, even above and beyond, it's really paid off. Literally, it's paid off and has allowed us to be in this financial situation that we're in so that we are coming out of this in a strong position. However, we do have those challenges coming forward. We still have a slight structural deficit, but we will be working with that. So again, I just wanted to thank all of our staff, including our finance staff, for really monitoring this and working through the pandemic these past 2 years. It's taken a lot of hard work and there's been a lot of unfilled vacancies, which has required more work, a greater workload on many of our employees. But we have seen the results of this is it's put us in a better financial footing going forward. So just wanted to thank everyone. So with that, may I get a roll call? The motion's been made and seconded. A roll call on the staff recommendation, please.
Yes, we'll start with Committee Member Gutierrez,
Yes.
Committee Member Harmon, Committee Member Harmon, can you hear us?
She was having internet issues, I think. So we'll go ahead and invite.
Okay. Committee Chair Friedman.
Yes. Motion passes. Thank you again, Mr. DiMartini. So we will close that item. And now we are on to item 2, which is the affordable housing loans for 211 West Gutierrez Street. And I will turn that over to Ms. Doubles. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, Chair Friedman and committee members Gutierrez and Harmon. My name is Laura Doubles and I'm the Housing and Human Services Manager for the city. Thank you for having me here today. And before I get started with the presentation, I would like to recognize and thank the many city partners that have come together with a common goal to assist a very valuable, affordable housing asset here in the city of Santa Barbara, known as El Zoco. Their efforts are all very much appreciated and demonstrates their dedication and commitment to preserving extremely coveted and very desperately needed affordable housing units for our community. These partners include the Housing Authority of the City of Santa Barbara, the County of Santa Barbara Housing and Community Development Department, Habitat for Humanity, and the Housing Trust Fund of Santa Barbara County. We have all worked hard together over many months to formulate this plan we are putting forth today for your consideration that works for all the partners and relieves a big burden for any one entity by spreading the commitment of resources between all of our partners. I sincerely thank each partner for their time, commitment, and dedication of resources to present this plan to you today, and would like to acknowledge several of these city partners are here at the presentation today as well. We'll go ahead and get started with the slides. Please, next slide. So our staff recommendation today is that the Finance Committee consider and recommend to the City Council to approve $200,000 from our Affordable Housing Inclusionary Fund to provide individual 30-year amortized loans at 3% simple interest to owners of qualifying owner-occupied units at the El Zoco condo complex to assist with their urgent rehabilitation and sustainability needs in exchange for new 90-year total, and I'll explain that in a little bit, affordability covenants on each unit assisted, as well as authorizing our community development director or his designee, subject to approval by our city attorney's office, such agreements and related city documents as necessary. Next slide, please. So we'll start with a little bit about the property. The property is located at 211 West Gutierrez Street. It was developed back in 1993, so it's approximately 28 years old. The developer was Homes for People Incorporated, which is now defunct. And the complex consists of 17 total units. 16 are still under affordability restrictions, and one was actually foreclosed upon years ago and was sold on market for market price. They are at an affordability category of moderate income, which is 80 to 120% AMI. Next slide, please. So our overall funding request is actually between the county and the city. The county of Santa Barbara is actually coming in to assist with this plan as well. So we've agreed to split the commitment of $400,000 to pay what the HOA is going to do as a special assessment for immediate repairs, which is extensive water damage and deterioration of common areas and the interiors of one unit, which has displaced that household. And that's been for many, many months. They have also upcoming repairs that their HOA reserve account is been depleted because of the expenses that have been realized from all of this damage from water intrusion. We also are going to replenish their reserve account so that they have enough going forward and to have available for future repair costs. Next slide, please. So the multi-jurisdictional partnership response on the screen here shows that if it's approved today for us to commit to $200,000, that the county will also take theirs forward to the Board of Supervisors for the other half at $200,000 to provide $400,000 in loan assistance. I want to recognize all of the in-kind assistance that all partners have dedicated already, time and meetings and review of documents, all the different areas that we've had to maneuver through to come up with a good plan. The Housing Authority will play a role in this in the future as being construction management, which will oversee all of the construction that's being bidded on to make sure that the scope of works are completed appropriately. And then our city housing staff will be actually providing administration of the loans moving forward if approved. Habitat for Humanity, I'd like to recognize them for coming in with a $50,000 grant to assist these households. They are able to assist low and very low income households. So that will actually relieve a little bit of the fiscal responsibility for those households, which will really help. The Housing Trust Fund has committed an additional $200,000 if and only if the repair costs exceed the assistance that you see on the screen here. Next slide, please. So our proposed individual loan breakdown, and these are all estimated because we don't know until we actually have this all approved, and then we go ahead and have all of the applications from all of the applicants that want to apply for the loan. We are figuring that our city support of $200,000 will be able to give 7 loans to individual owners. And the reason for us using the inclusionary fund is so that we can assist up to upper middle income category, which is 200% AMI or below. Now, as I stated, the restrictions right now on this property are moderate, but that was only for when they moved in. And so now with assisting them now, their household incomes may have changed. And what we want to be able to do is provide the loans for assistance up to at least the 200% AMI or below. The county is wanting to support loans that are from the low income category or below. That means 80% AMI or below. And we estimate that that's going to be about 6 loans to individual owners. So as I said, these are estimates, and actuals would be determined at the time of loan applications and us verifying and underwriting all of the household income verifications. Next slide, please. So just as a sample loan term, what each household who takes a loan, I did a simple average on what we foresee the loan to be. The balance would be about a $27,000 loan. It would be amortized over a 30-year term, and we would be asking for 3% simple interest. So that is really good terms right now to be able to assist each household. That monthly payment, the average looks to be about $114. Next slide, please. And each unit that does apply for a loan and is qualified for a loan, we would be recording a new affordability covenant on each of those units. Now, what that means, though, is we are going to only do a total of 90 years. So, for example, here on the screen, if they had a already completed 20 years in their current covenant that's on the property, we are going to request a 90-year total. So that would mean that we would be recording a new covenant for 63, the difference in the years. We would again restrict these to the moderate income level, just as originally done with the project. Next slide, please. So the benefits to the owner is it accomplishes urgent repair needs. Many of these households do not have the resources or the ability to get loans to help in this urgent situation. It was something that was definitely unplanned for. All the reserves were, like I said, depleted, trying to first tackle all of these urgent repairs, but just didn't have enough to do so. They also will have favorable loan terms, just as I explained before, and they will have predictable and reasonable loan payments. It also ensures long-term housing stability for each of their units. Next slide, please. The benefits to the city. We would be getting amortized monthly payments to replenish our inclusionary fund. And that would actually give us that resource to cycle those funds for eventual new affordable housing developments. It preserves long-term owner-occupied affordable housing, which is very rare here at El Zoco. And it avoids costs associated with rehousing and relocating displaced households. Next slide, please. So again, staff's recommendation is on the screen, and I am here available for any questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ms. Doubles. Appreciate the presentation. So before getting public comment, do we have any questions from my colleagues? Councilmember Harmon.
Thank you very much. thanks, Chair Friedman. Thank you, Ms. Doubles. And I apologize. My internet has been going in and out, so I'm so sorry if you have already covered this. I apologize. This is really exciting. I know we had been having meetings about this for many months, and I have to say, I know I'll get to my question, but I'm so grateful for your work putting together this solution. This is really just wonderful. So thank you. Can you speak a little bit about the engagement with the El Zoco residents and how the process of developing this, was it collaborative, how it worked, and what I'm hoping some folks will be here for public comment, but can you tell us a little bit about their interest level in what you're laying out? And again, sincerely, thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Committee Member Harmon. Yes, El Zoco actually came to us and was asking for assistance. And we had a really good partner in the Housing Authority that had a lot of knowledge on different aspects of repair work that's needed on housing complexes such as that. So they helped us a lot, but I have to say it was definitely a very collaborative approach. We met many times all together. We met with the HOA members. Miss Shayla Royce is here as well. She's the president of the HOA. Mr. Ben Best, he was also, I believe he's the treasurer, but he was the one that actually was able to work with us, with all the partners reviewing their HOA reserve account and all of their revenues and their expenses. We projected out 20 years. We added an inflationary factor and made sure that they were going to be okay with what our proposal was. They felt very happy with that, they felt secure that they would, moving forward, they would have enough to not only tackle this big issue, urgent issue, and to get that household back into their unit, but also to be able to afford moving forward, going, with their reserves, being able to cover everything. So I really enjoyed working with the El Zoco HOA. They have been extremely committed and very flexible, wanting to, what could they do to get some help? And so we desperately wanted to help them as well. And so this is a plan that all of us devised, that everybody, all of our partners and El Zoco's HOA apparently their membership when they've had their HOA meetings, they all are on board and very appreciative if the city does provide this support.
Right, thank you for Ms. Doubles. I don't have any questions. It doesn't look like there's any further questions. So at this time, I will open it up to public comment. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak? If so, please raise your hand in the app.
Chair Friedman, I am seeing one hand raised, Mr. Best.
Okay, Mr. Best, you have floor is yours.
Oh, well, great. Thank you so much, Chair Friedman and council members, and Laura Doubles for that excellent presentation. And I just have to repeat the heaps of thanks to all the fine folks at the City of Santa Barbara, the County of Santa Barbara, Habitat for Humanity, the Housing Trust Fund of Santa Barbara, and also very much the Housing Authority of Santa Barbara, and all the people that have made this option available to El Zoco so that we can fix our unit from this water damage and get our neighbors back in their home. It's been over a year now, and we're really concerned about the rainy season upon us with the studs now exposed. So super appreciative of this opportunity, and I mostly just wanted to heap my thanks upon all involved, and including Megan Harmon, who was kind enough to have conversations with us. We've just been really entreated by the overwhelming open arms and willingness to work with us to find solutions moving forward. So thank you again all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Best. Any other members of the public that wish to speak?
Yes, Chair Friedman, there's one more hand raised, Skip Szymanski. I will unmute you now, Skip.
Mr. Szymanski, you have the floor.
Chair Friedman, Councilmember Harmon, and Councilmember Gutierrez, thank you for even considering this. It was a while ago that the city had approached the Housing Authority to see if there was anything that we could do to help this for sale affordable housing condominium complex. The situation that they were faced with is something that is, it's very unfortunate with water intrusion that is not readily apparent. So when that happens, it causes a slow deterioration. Fortunately, the homeowners did eventually reach out and did get some assistance. But as you get into that kind of destructive testing, we'll call it, the problems seem to grow. As Ms. Doubles said, the Homeowners Association, the people from El Zoco have been extremely cooperative, willing to work through this situation. But again, when you're dealing with an affordable housing complex, your finances or your revenues are limited. So this seemed to be the best solution that we could all come up with. So again, it's a collaborative effort. The Housing Authority will stay in cooperation to help both the funding draws and the actual site work. But we fully support this loan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Szymanski. Appreciate your comments and the work of the Housing Authority and the partnership that you are contributing towards this as well. Any other members of the public that wish to speak to this item?
Chair Friedman, there are no other hands raised at this time.
So I will close public comment and now turn it over for comments. And then we do need to have a motion on this item. So Councilmember Harmon, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair Friedman. Well, yeah, I don't have too much to add other than just, again, expressing my sincere appreciation for everyone involved. I mean, I do remember some early initial conversations about this issue, maybe 6 months ago. And it's just so gratifying to see how collaboratively everyone has worked and with the same goal in mind, which is to serve our residents and to make sure that our affordable housing stock is safe, that it can stay affordable. It just really is, it is demonstrative of everyone, all parties really rowing in the same direction and coming up with a truly effective solution to a real problem. So I'm absolutely thrilled, and truly, Ms. Doubles, your staff, the folks at the HOA, the residents of El Zoco, the Housing Authority. I mean, it worked so beautifully, and I'm so appreciative, truly. I also wanted to say that since beginning these conversations, I've heard from other residents who are in our owned affordable housing stock who have the same issue or similar issues and anticipate a similar need in the years to come. So I just wanted to put a plug out there for this type of approach more broadly, and perhaps Ms. Doubles, Mr. Smansky, Mr. DiMartini, and we can all put our heads together to think about how we can expand this program to include more than just El Zoco, but all of our affordable housing stock. We know that much of our housing in the city of Santa Barbara, particularly the affordable housing, whether it's affordable by covenant or more affordable by sort of just the status of the unit, really is in need of refurbishment. And I think this is such a positive step forward for our residents that I would like to see it expanded. And that's sort of where I would like us to go next with this. But for now, just truly my thanks, my appreciation, and really excited for those residents of El Zoco to get back into their home where they belong. So with that, Chair Friedman, I would be happy to make the motion that we approve $200,000 in affordable housing inclusionary funds to provide loans to qualifying owner-occupied units at the El Zoco condo complex. And I guess to also authorize the Community Development Director to execute, subject to approval from the City Attorney, such agreements and related documents as necessary.
And just to clarify, there's also the affordability covenant, so it is the full staff recommendation that you're moving.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you. So moved.
And is there a second?
Second, that's me. Sorry, my camera's a little slow.
Great, it's been seconded by Councilmember Gutierrez. I'll too just be brief and want to thank all parties involved for coming to this really innovative solution to this. As Councilmember Harmon was saying, we need to ensure not only the affordability of our units, but also the quality of the units. And this is a way to ensure that and also get the individuals back in their home. It's been quite some time, over a year as what we've been informed. So hopefully that will get us to where we need to be. And then also, as part of this, the ability to extend the affordability covenants out decades beyond when they were to expire ensures that our housing stock continues to remain affordable for decades to come, as some of those were going to be expiring in 10, 15 or so years from now. So to be able to have that extension and be able to provide this funding to improve the quality is, as my former boss, Salud Carbajal, used to say, a win-win-win for everybody. So with that, may we have a roll call, please?
Okay, roll call. We'll start with Committee Member Harmon,
Yes.
Committee Member Gutierrez,
Yes.
and Committee Chair Friedman.
Yes.
The motion passes unanimously.
Thank you, everyone. And with that, there are no further items on today's agenda, so this meeting of the Finance Committee is adjourned. Thank you all very much.